Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends. Welcome back to another episode of our /ProRevenge. Guys, you've got to fasten your seatbelts today because today's episode is one long story. It's about a grandmother getting revenge on two greedy pastors when they basically demanded her life savings be donated to their church while she was on her deathbed. Guys, it's a very long tale with a fantastic outcome, so buckle up and enjoy the story. And do hit that subscribe button for future revenge stories if you aren't subscribed already. Let's dive in. So, my grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. This church, which I'll call Big White Church, was a member of the large evangelical denomination. Big White Church was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the deep south of the USA. Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights, and was very active in supporting home missions, as well as helping other youth programs. She always tithed and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. I've seen this firsthand many times. Although I belong to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to Big White Church functions with her. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of youth, a task which took over 2 hours in the church's large kitchen. Then after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the breakfast. I remember that on a youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelistic materials that one of the assistant pastors, who we'll call AS, had forgotten and asked her to go get in time for our morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, who I'll call Pompous Pastor, never found out that AS had screwed up or that Grandma had fixed it for him. AS never even thanked Grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I asked her about it. She said she didn't mind at all. She told me that her reward would be those materials would help people find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73 when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and she could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership, and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc., without success. Every one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, Pompous Pastor, whom she'd known for 30 years, to visit her so they could plan her memorial service. Pompous Pastor was too busy, but AS stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here is what happened at the meeting, with my grandma literally on her deathbed. Grandma, Grandpa, and AS discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes, then AS started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They then went back to discussing her funeral for a few minutes. Then AS steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with the liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs because she was terminally ill and in a huge amount of physical pain. AS would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but then he would go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, and he says, "Where your treasure is, your heart will be also." My grandma starts crying. To put this into context, Grandma was more than just a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond and wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried and never ever cried about herself. Not one tear when the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again. Not even during the following 6 months in futile rehab. She would shed sincere but well-managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would also cry to console others, weep with those who weep, but nobody, not Grandpa, not her daughter, nor any of my uncles or grandma's siblings ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandmother was sobbing uncontrollably. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of her sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away, and we held a memorial service at the funeral home, not the big white church. Pompous Pastor and AS were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from the big white church at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in the front crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited Pompous Pastor and AS from the funeral service. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you've attended. It's going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife, tell a story about her, or anything else you want to say that will honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone here today. Please, if you want to say something, come up here and do so." There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we'd planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours. And the best I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying, and hugging, and 3 of her grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar, and we all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they've ever attended. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills because she told my mom that this makes it easier for us to respect each other's turf, and because their lawyer had recommended it. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained neighborhood for the past 50 years and had worked hard and lived modestly, but it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. Of course, there's no legal documents for anyone to attend the reading of the will, or to even have a reading. Modern telecommunications and near-universal literacy have made this quaint custom practically extinct. But the reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit family members an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. They were too difficult to schedule for our large family, but we got together at birthdays, holidays, funerals, baptisms, etc. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill may have been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa that Grandma's will contained some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, uncles, great-uncles, and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see Pompous Pastor and AS from the big white church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for the big white church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins, and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than the average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled, and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space to fit all of us. Grandma's lawyer even suggested that Pompous Pastor and AS sit in chairs that were in front of the room next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these 2 preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everybody else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the packed and overflowing room before the entire meeting was over. There was no escape. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we'd expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts, and everything that remained after all the bequests had been satisfied. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received a nice but not extravagant amount of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was the first beneficiary listed in the will, but after him, all the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s, Then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece, and nephew received a little more. Then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts, etc. Bequests to the Big White Church, Pompous Pastor, and AS were the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation, as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largest. When Grandma's lawyer got to the Big White Church and the preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to the Big White Church, Pompous Pastor, and AS, Miss Grandma's name has requested that I read the following statement to everybody present." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own writing, and the letter said, "For the past 10 years, not one person from the Big White Church has ever called me, come visit me, or sent me a note to tell me they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the churchwomen, not even one of the church members who I worked with all those years, who had loved dearly and I thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many, many years, but when I needed you and your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit, when I was dying, and invited Pompous Pastor to come to my house and help me to plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still love dearly, even though they made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church, maybe some of my church friends, whom I've not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they love to hear Pompous Pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But Pompous Pastor could not find the time to visit me, or even called to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. AS came by my house, but he did not want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all, just remember his church in my will. It was then I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time. AS did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will, long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for what was now my former church, Big White Church. The lawyer then read the amount. He named the amount, an enormous amount of money, generating muffled wows from many of our heirs, including me. He then continued reading the letter, and Grandma said, "But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as Pompous Pastor and AS, so I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money I left to the Big White Church to match all the love they've showed me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely and no longer able to work my ass off for them for free, like I had done for almost half a century." The lawyer then said, "This is her entire written statement. Now let's get back to the bequest in the will. Bequest to AS, 1 cent. Bequest to Pompous Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. Pompous Pastor and AS sat there, looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's families and friends felt an urge to laugh out loud, but we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for the 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. The lawyer continued and said, "There is one last bequest for a charity called," which he then named and I'll call Black Charity. Then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea what Black Charity was, but by the looks on their faces, we can tell that Pompous Pastor and AS knew Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread, and horror that they would have had if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal." Every eye in the room was now fixated on Pompous Pastor and AS. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, one of Grandma and Grandpa's sons, let the silence continue to grow for a few seconds more. If we'd been able to read Pompous Pastor and AS's minds, we would have known the history behind the looks of their faces. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from Big White Church. They ran a free food and clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. So, a long time ago, Big White Church, which was, and still is, 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to black charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because black charity was practicing the social gospel, while the Big White Church was preaching the true gospel. Big White Church even tried to sue to get some of their money back, and although the suit was eventually settled, very little money actually changed hands. But this, being the Deep South, everybody knew the real reason why Big White Church, or any white church, would stop supporting a black charity. Those N-words were getting uppity and not staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving Big White Church at that time, but they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade anyone, but maybe they could reach some of their youth at the church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is my mission field." We did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she died. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to the black charity every month. Pompous Pastor and AS obviously understood what Grandma was saying to them. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racist, condemned their bigotry, and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These black human beings whom you hate, disrespect, and have mistreated are better people than you are, so they deserve my money more than you do." The lawyer then said, "The exact amount is..." Then he named the exact amount that Grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to Big White Church if she had not changed her will. What a revenge, and a kick in the teeth as well. My friends, I know religion is a touchy subject, so I'll let you guys leave the comments down below. Let me know what you thought of the story. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our /ProRevenge. If you guys enjoyed the story today, do hit that like button, and subscribe if you aren't already. If you missed the last ProRevenge episode, a teacher slams OP's friend into a window, and then loses everything. Check it out if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next one. I love you.